So when you go to look for therapy for your trauma in the UK, there's a whole bunch of terms that can get a bit confusing. And I'm going to try to bring clarity to that, but I don't know how successful I'll be. In the UK, we use a term therapist, right? And therapist is a catch-all term for counsellors and psychotherapists. So there's been a debate for a long time about the difference between counsellors and psychotherapists. And we use the term therapist to just say one of the two, either a counsellor or a psychotherapist. In terms of what's the difference between the two, I'm not going to go there, but I will just say one thing that might be helpful. I hope psychotherapists, the way they practice tends to be based on theories of psychodynamic. You think you know these things until you hit record on a camera. Psychodynamic approach, psychodynamic theory. Yeah, psychodynamic theory. And psychodynamic theory looks at your past and how that's impacting your present, which makes a lot of sense when we're talking about abuse, right? If we got abuse in our past, that's impacting our present. Some counselors, however, will use aspects of psychodynamic theory. So just because you see a counselor doesn't mean that they're not going to look at your past and how it impacts your present. So you go to see a therapist, whether they're a counselor or a psychotherapist, you want to see someone who is trauma informed. And you actually, when they say they're trauma informed, you want to actually ask them, so what do you know about trauma? Tell me what your understanding of trauma is. Tell me how the way you're going to work with me is informed by your knowledge of trauma. You want to actually check that they really do know what they're talking about. Now, you've also got psychologists and psychiatrists. And when I had PTSD, I didn't see a psychiatrist or a psychologist. I saw a counselor. My counselor did have a degree in counseling psychology, but they weren't a psychologist. A counselor, a trauma counselor, can help you with your trauma if you have mental health problems that actually need to be seen by a psychologist or a psychiatrist. A good trauma therapist will spot that and will suggest to you that you see a psychologist or psychiatrist. If you see your GP and share about the problems you're facing with your trauma, your GP might refer you to a counselor or a psychotherapist. They might refer you to a psychologist, or they might refer you to a psychiatrist. So if you are going to see a therapist, and by that I mean either a counselor or a psychotherapist, if you're going to see a therapist, then I would suggest you want to find someone who follows an ethical framework. And there's different ethical frameworks for different bodies out there. So the thing to know about counselling and therapists is that in the UK, it's not a protected title. Anyone can call himself a counsellor, okay? Anyone could just say, I'm a counsellor, right? And that title is not protected. So you do want to do a bit of homework to see this counsellor, this therapist I'm going to see, because anyone could call themselves a therapist. You know, are they actually working to an ethical framework? And there's a few governing bodies that give ethical frameworks, and people who become members of those groups, they have to go by the ethical framework. So one of the really well-known ones is the BACP, which is the British Association of Counsellors and Psychotherapists. So the BACP, if a therapist is going to become a member of the BACP, if you look at their spec right now, it's expected that you've done X amount of hours training with X amount of practice and X amount of supervision and X amount of personal therapy. And They have an ethical framework, which I think is got a lot of really good stuff in the ethical framework. And so if you see someone who's a BACP therapist, they've got this framework they're going to work to when they're working with you. But not everyone wants to join the BACP. Some people instead have joined the NCS, which might, by the time you're watching this video, it might have changed their name. Right, okay, now they have an ethical framework which is very similar to the BACP. Some people join them. I believe at the moment it's a bit, it costs less to join them than the BACP. Some people might, for cost reasons, join them instead of the BACP. There's other reasons why people might do them, but they have an ethical framework as well. Then you've got the UK CP, which is the UK Council of Psychotherapists, and they have an ethical framework. And then another one that's really well known, which I was surprised how well known it is in the secular world, but the ACC, is that the Association of Christian Counselors, I think, and they have an ethical framework as well. So what I'm getting at here is, if you're going to see a therapist, see what ethical framework they work with. And sometimes you've got people, they've been counselors for years, and for years they were with a particular governing body, and then they left it for whatever financial reasons or whatever other reasons. And it doesn't mean they don't work to an ethical framework. But you might want to check that. Now, these governing bodies, they also will have like complaints procedures, so that if you've got a complaint and you say one of your therapists, I want to say one of your therapists, it doesn't mean they work for the governing body, but they might have accreditation with the governing body, or they might be listed as a member with the governing body. And you could put in a complaint saying the counselling I got from them was bad because of da-da-da-da, and they will look into it. So I hope that has brought a bit of clarity, and apologies if it didn't, if it just made you even more confused. But you can go on their websites and you can see what are their criteria for members. Some of them have different tiers of membership, like you can be a student counsellor there, because when you do your training for counselling, you have to do some placement hours. A lot of governing bodies would require you to do 100 placement hours, and you can do those as a student counsellor, as a trainee counsellor. And then you might have the next tier, which is to be a member of that governing body as a counsellor, and then you might have the next tier, which is accredited member. And so you can go on their websites, check these things out. So when you're looking for a therapist, have a look for these things to see. And a lot of therapists are they will give you a session with them, sometimes like a 20-minute free session, where you can just get to know them and see, do I gel with this person? You can ask them any questions you've got about the kind of the approach they're going to take. And so it's really important that you pick someone that you are comfortable with, that you're going to be comfortable with, and in my opinion, that they do work to some kind of ethical framework. All right, take care.